For many first-time students at Seattle University School of Theology and Ministry, our very first theology class is Christian anthropology, where our first written assignment is a 5-page paper on what it means to be human. It's an interesting question to explore. It's also interesting that many of my classmates, including myself, had never had the question posed to us before. It is further interesting that no matter how a student goes about tackling the question, he or she never comes up with an adequate or complete definition. I received a good grade on the assignment, but to this day, I am still working on that question. It's the kind of question that makes me think about my life, how frail and vulnerable it appears to be. Growing up in a black community, positioned in society with little political voice or economic prowess, seemingly always on the cusp of crisis, and yet still, by the grace of God, managing not only to survive, but survive with human dignity. It's the kind of question that I think about in the face of today's stories of racist terrorism, where people who look like me are being killed without consequence for the culprits that commit the murders. It also makes me think about immigration and human trafficking. All these types of issues, when I think about them, can be really exhausting. And yet, as largely as endemic as these situations can be, in all my frailty and weakness as one voice, I still feel called to speak out as a person of Christian faith, engaging the depths of today's realities. The author of Psalm 8 is found asking the question, what does it mean to be human? What is a human being to God? After reflecting on God's heavenly creation. When the author considers the stars and the moon, the intricacies of God's works, they can't help but ponder the question, what are human beings to God? The universe is such a big place, and we are so little and frail compared to the vastness of it. Why is God mindful of us? Why does God care for us? I believe that this Psalm 8 prayer that the writer addresses directly to God has been read and or written over many periods in time and has had significant meaning for the communities of faith that have read it. I imagine it being read in the Davidic period during turbulent, life-threatening circumstances. At a time of Jewish history, postmarked by Babylonian exile, I imagine that the reader found comfort in such vulnerable circumstances to think that when they look up to the night sky, the Eternal, who created it and created them as well, thinks and cares about them. And even today, when we read the prayer, with various circumstances that we face, our mortality, our concern for our loved ones, and the many aspects of life that this world brings to us that we find concern over, we can find meaning in this prayer. That in the backdrop of troubles and concerns that we experience, among the joys that life presents to us as well, God is thinking of us and cares for us as his children. It is in this prayer that we find a God who is a sustainer of life in a culture that can seem to promote ideologies that do not sustain life. It is a friction and a tension that we live in, that when we are anchored in the spiritual rootedness of our relationship with God, can bring new life. Jesus, in the Gospel of Mark, is finding himself in friction and tension with the religious leaders and how they understand the law and Jewish identity. The matter in Mark 3, 1 through 6 is only one instance where Jesus's ideas and ministry are at odds with the religious leaders. He throws them off when he tells the paralytic man who was lowered down through the roof in the house that his sins were forgiven, and confirmed it by healing him. He eats with sinners, raising additional questions by the religious leaders. When a question was raised about his disciples' lack of fasting practices, he gives them a big picture explanation. You can't put new wine in new wineskins. And finally, before the incident in Mark 3, there was an initial conflicting idea and interpretation about Sabbath law. What does it mean to be human from the perspective of Jesus in these situations? With the paralytic man, Jesus seems to be saying that nothing will keep us away from the healing love of God if we seek it out. When he ate with sinners, he seems to be saying that being human, being a child of God, means demonstrating that God is not excluding anyone from the beloved community. When he spoke of new wine and new wineskins, he seems to be saying that being human involves embracing the changes that the dynamic Spirit of God presents to us within our lives just when we think that we have life, ministry, and the world all figured out. When he told the religious leaders that the Sabbath was made for human beings and not human beings for the Sabbath, he seemed to be continuing to form the idea that being human is about being in a loving relationship with God and with one another, rather than the practice or observance of laws and rituals. These ideas were in friction with the traditional interpretations that the culture, society, and religious leaders held. Maybe God at times uses this friction and tension between the truth of love and the ideas of the overarching societies in order to point to his glory, presence, and being. The dilemma that comes out of these tensions is one that Jesus points to with questions posed to the religious leaders before healing the man with the withered hand. Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill? They were honest questions that everyone knew the answers to, including the Pharisees. Yet they responded with secret plots to kill Jesus. And Jesus is vulnerable enough to be killed. He knew that they were planning to kill him, and that as a human being, he was capable of being killed. But his faith called him to persist in preaching, teaching, and demonstrating what life would look like on earth if God were sovereign. So what are human beings to God, especially for people and communities of faith like Tibbetts United Methodist Church? When I think about Jesus and what it means to be human, I think about the tradition and history of the United Methodist Church in the stories that I have heard of its founder, John Wesley. His faith and convictions moved him to actions of social justice. I understand that before he died, he made his contribution in ending slavery in England, among other issues related to the human condition. It is this type of meaning in being human that I gravitate toward and that I believe God is calling us to. We are called to do good and not harm, to save life, not kill. With our lives, we are called to preach and teach and demonstrate what life would look like on earth if God were sovereign. We are children of God, facing the depths of reality that calls us to be courageous in our identity. May it be so for you and me. Amen.